Good morning, Vietnam. I'll put the link out for this epistemically vicious attack upon Matthew Adelstein and his arguments. Let me put it in the Benthams Bulldog debate with Matt Dillahunty. He's probably not on there. Dillahunty. Yeah, there he is. Wait, Matt Dillahunty. Yeah, boom. And where else should I put it? Possibly in the Discord. Big review ting. Not you, Punch V Venom. Everyone. Big review ting. And I got a lot of requests from people. Oh no, there's other shit people want me to review as well. Why have I become the gossip YouTuber? The gossip YouTuber. Thank you, Harmonica Luke. Hang on. Let me just for a second turn my camera off while I go and get something. Oh, sorry. What was that? That's my summer outfit. All will become clear. So what I'm reviewing is this. And we'll see if anyone can figure out the outfit. Oh, starting soon.
Today, okay, we are live. Hello and welcome everybody. Today,
a wise man once said, "Conceive, believe, achieve, and fake it till you make it." So that's what I'm going for.
Today's date is May 24th, 2025, and this is the inaugural debate here on the Atheist Debates channel. So, over the years, Matt has posted debates done elsewhere, both online and in person, but this is the first time we've hosted one here live. And for this initial run,
as many of you know, I'm a conservative, so I've decided that as a conservative, I have to rebrand myself to fit in with my team. And so that's why I'm doing this, because otherwise the West will decline or something.
We have selected somebody who has called into many of the live programs we do over on the line and demonstrated that he's very serious and dedicated to.
And just to say on this point, I'm pretty sure. So Matthew called into the atheist. Or no, did he call into the line? Was it? Let's see. Matthew Adelstein, the line calling. I can't remember where it was, but it was one of Matt Dillahunty's call-in shows. And this was maybe about 6 months ago or something. And Matthew called in. It was quite funny, actually, because obviously Matthew is studying analytic philosophy full-time. And so the level of kind of argumentation that hang on, something just fell off my foot. I've got to deal with that. The level of argumentation that he's dealing with, fucking hell, and I've dropped that as well. It's all going wrong. This is preemptive of the stream. The level of argumentation that he's dealing with is sort of far more sophisticated than the level of argumentation that sort of Matt is typically dealing with. In terms of, it's usually look at the trees people calling in. Now, I personally am more sympathetic to the look at the trees people than I am to sort of the types of arguments that Matthew gives. But what was quite funny is I think it did quite nicely highlight some of the biases and bigotries of the sorts of atheists who are into the line. Now, it can be fun or cathartic if you've deconverted from a high control extreme religion, I think, to see people like Matt kind of beating up on people who have been very stupid. And I do think that has its place. The world is a complicated place full of all sorts of people at different stages of life and coming at things from different angles. And so I think it was funny because Matt was obviously sort of outclassed intellectually, but Matt was still doubling down on I'm right, demonstrating that he's not really able to sort of like admit when he's wrong, even when he can see that he's wrong in those kind of situations. I agree with what Pops BJD is saying, that sort of like expecting him to engage in the way you want is a little bit unreasonable. But that's why I think it's a power move, right? Is because they want to, the atheist experience people, they want to sort of like claim the intellectual high ground for the views that they hold. But I think that what that demonstrates is that they don't really, the intellectual high ground is more pluralistic than they want to let on. Their kind of story about reality is there's only one right way of thinking about all this stuff, and we've got it, and it's like super kind of fundamentalist in its approach, in my view. Whereas I think that what Matthew demonstrated is that you can actually go levels beyond that in terms of the sort of like rationalist discourse, but come to completely different conclusions. And it highlighted the fundamentalist tendencies, I think, of that side. And then I think what you see in the responses for a lot of people, some responses I'm slightly sympathetic to, saying that this type of analytic philosophy is very different to why people get engaged with religion. And I agree with those criticisms, but I think that those criticisms don't necessarily undermine the legitimacy of religion. Instead, I think that they can potentially restore the legitimacy of religion, right? But the reaction from the audience also showed, I think, a lot of the fundamentalism in their ways of viewing things, because there's this immediate reaction to want to come to the defense of Matt Dillahunty as a figurehead of, a particular type of atheism, as the guy who's in the know. But actually, he was in the wrong in that case. And I think what you would see with a healthier audience is people saying, do you know what, Matt, actually, you've gone too far on this occasion. You should change your mind on this thing, or you shouldn't have been as much of a dick to that guy. But instead, I think what you saw with people kind of clapping along and saying, yeah, way to go, Matt, you did a great job just kicking him off, is a kind of closed-mindedness that a lot of those people claim to be better than or have escaped from, So it's complicated, but I think that's my view of the previous interactions. Don't know exactly how this thing came about, this talk, if it was the upshot of that previous conversation, but here we go. Also, let me know if you're getting feedback on the mic or anything.
Defending his beliefs and goes beyond the typical attempts we get from most of our callers. So feel ready to kick off the series with someone like this, who, irrespective of age or credentials, we want, someone who's going to honestly present what they believe and defend their position. So if you are watching and you're someone like this and you would like to participate, definitely feel free to contact Matt or I to try to get that set up. So, all right, today's topic and format. The topic for today is we should believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being. Arguing in the affirmative for that.
By the way, I will say also, as a postmodern neo-Marxist, that people commenting on the outfit decision is deliberate, and I will see if people are able to get on board with my subversive 5-dimensional chess.
Is Matthew Adelstein here on the right side of the screen, and arguing on the negative is Matt Dillahunty. We'll be doing 15-minute openings, beginning with the affirmative, 5-minute rebuttals for each, beginning with the affirmative, 30 minutes of open discussion, and then 30 minutes of questions from the audience. We'll be sourcing those through super chats. I'm not going to put a super chat threshold on the, I'm not going to say math, the chat. All right, are you ready?
Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Ready? Let me set you up here.
I didn't hear the kind words. Maybe it was just saying like a formidable debater at the start or something.
And get the timer ready. All right, are you ready?
Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, go ahead.
Or maybe for the cynical. And look, you got to go through a lot of trauma to be as cynical as I am. Not everyone has, experienced the same levels of trauma. But you might think such a thing is being nice is a rhetorical strategy. You have it from me. Being nice ain't real. It's a rhetorical strategy. and Matthew is evil. That's what I want to put out there at the start. Matthew is an evil man who anything he says about a nice thing, it's optics for the audience. He's an evil guy. Trust me. Trust.
All right. So first, let me thank Arden for moderating and Matt for agreeing to do this.
Too much buttering up. It's like, what would you call it? No, I can't believe it's not butter. Easy. What's it called? Like easy spread. Easy spread.
Matt and I agree about the importance of considering evidence and avoiding irrational dogmatism in pseudoscience, like denial of vaccine.
I'm just going to say on that, I think that that's also a good point to hit on, because those sorts of things are obviously what Matt's audience view themselves as being, the sort of like rational purveyors of science. I fucking love science truth. And so I think it's a good move to hit home on that point, because it kind of, what it does is it is going to really juxtapose any behaviors then of Matt Dillahunty's, which he often deploys in debates, of getting quite kind of irate and not just getting irate, but kind of like using dogmatism really to defend his views, and like, I have a bigger audience than you to defend his views.
Efficacy and belief in young earth creationism. If you at home would like to follow along with my opening statement, on my blog, Benthams Bulldog, which you can find by Googling, you can find a written transcript of it with sources included, as well as links to where you can find out more about the arguments I'm giving. One brief comment before I get into the arguments. I think a lot of atheists can have a tendency not to give theistic arguments a fair shake, to assume from the outset that they must be stupid, like belief in Santa Claus. This isn't rational. Many smart philosophers and scientists believe in God, unlike Santa Claus. While this doesn't make the view true, it does mean that it's pretty unlikely that all the arguments for it are obviously fallacious. Many atheists, like Alex O'Connor, have come to see theistic arguments as more formidable than they previously believed.
Just to say on this, again, I think it's going to be very hard to find a neutral place from which to evaluate whether or not contemporary philosophy of religion ought to be taken seriously. You know, I would say that, for example, I understand all of these arguments to a similar level as like Matthew does. And yet I, because of different metaphilosophical commitments, I just don't think that contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, or analytic philosophy more generally, should really be taken seriously by anyone. And so I don't think that the everyman has to waste his or her time in the way that I feel I've wasted my time to get to a point to be rationally justified to believe or say that. Now, it's certainly true that people disagree with that as well. And if people disagree with that, then they're going to think that the right thing to do is to engage with this stuff, in more detail and spend more time on it. But I think the mere existence of, say, some people who believe one thing, of course you're going to say that if you also think that, right? You're going to point to those people. And if you disagree, you're going to point to different people. I don't see why that should give someone a reason to take it seriously. Or maybe here's another thing, right? Is I do think Matthew's right that there's a certain type of dogmatism that a lot of Dillahunty's atheist audience will have. And that type of dogmatism is like, it's just very tribalistic, and it's not very thoughtful. It's not even very intelligent. Sometimes I want to be like, some of these people are justified. Okay, here's the conditions under which I say it's justified. If these people are like, this just smells fishy to me. Like, it smells like bullshit, and can you just like leave me alone? I want to get on with my life. That sort of thing, I think, is justified. Now, if these people, however, instead want to spend all their time talking about how they've got their intellectual high ground and these arguments, but then they also don't do a good job with that, then I think they're in this position of dogmatism where they can't use the excuse of, I'm not willing to put the time into this, or, I'm just a simple man, because they're often claiming that they're these rationally smart people. They're often claiming that, all the facts are on their side, and they clearly have the time because they spend the time. And so in that case, these people don't have an excuse for not going a little bit further and having more to say and being more sophisticated. So my view on the dogmatism point is a little bit more nuanced. I want to say there's a space for people who just want to say, do you know what, this just sounds crazy to me, like, please leave me alone, I just want to like play with my kids and like go to my work. And I also want to say that there's a place for people, like, I want to hold people to account who are terminally online with these things but don't ever seem to be making any progress in terms of getting better and more refined in their views, and having, that they should be aware of objections but they're not, and stuff like that. So yeah.
After studying philosophy, I think many of my disagreements with Matt will come down to epistemology, which is about how one comes to know things. So let me describe how I think one should evaluate hypotheses about the world. First, one should look at the prior probability of a hypothesis, how likely it is before gathering any data. Even though the theory that I'm cheating in poker and the...
Yeah, I honestly think that this is an incoherent notion, in the sense of some kind of like pure a priori. I think it makes sense in a context. I think it makes sense in certain experimental contexts, which is why I think that, methods of inverse probability can be applied well in the sciences in certain cases. Also, not always as well. I actually think a lot of frequentist statistical tests are better. Part of the reason that I think they're better is that they place an emphasis on trusting in the methodology and the experimental setup and things like that. That's a whole different topic for a different day. But the problem is that, decoupled from the scientific context where these things are actually being put to work to establish something, the constraints are so much looser. And so people will talk in this loose sense of like prior to any data. Like what does that mean? Like prior to any data? First off, right, a lot of the people who are coming to apply these Bayesian arguments are doing so after years of having thought about these arguments in the first place, after having, being inducted into philosophy of religion, learning Aquinas's 5 ways, learning Craig's Kalam, knowing some deductive logic, knowing where they sit and situate themselves relative to a bunch of arguments. And then they're coming and learning this Bayesian apparatus. So what, like prior to any data? So that's kind of storytelling. It's not that they are doing that. It's that they're telling a story about what a sort of hypothetical person who was in just the right situation would or should believe about certain things. And that is a big issue for me, because it's never clear to me how much this applies to the actual individuals who are saying these things. Second point on that is that the notion of prior to all data, to me, is nonsensical. It literally is completely incoherent. And prior to all data means that you don't have a language. Without a language, there's nothing to talk about. There's just nothing to be said, right? You've not got any data whatsoever. Languages are things that are taught empirically. The a priori is some philosophical myths that a bunch of philosophers have come up with. It just doesn't exist in my view. Now, what you could do is you could say, no, I just mean in a looser sense, right? All I'm doing is I'm using this as a rough heuristic to try and give us a sort of like fair playing field to be able to discuss these things. Now, there's a sense in which that's fair enough. What the problem will be is if you grant that, sort of like being charitable, you're like, okay, fair enough, let's do that then. But then all of the work is being done by the speculation about the prior and the likelihoods, which is, very simply the major parts of what's going on. And if it's all done through speculative assumptions about those things, well, then what's the use of it, right? Because we granted it just for the sake of it creating this even playing field, but then you're like, well, I actually just can't assign these things now. So it's like saying, look, we can make a game where, where we talk in iambic pentameter, and whoever spits the most stanzas is the winner. And like, for sure we could do that, but what would that establish? What would that actually establish? Like, we created some rules about how we're going to engage in the discourse, and I demonstrated that I can engage with those rules a little bit better. But really, what does that establish? I can have a little bit more to say about the principle of indifference or something. What does that establish? I think not too much. So I've got all of these problems with these sorts of things. And I do actually think that the problem is that you'll get this sort of like talk of epistemic humility, as in, look, it's a very kind of like humble thesis I'm putting forward. I'm just suggesting that we use this as a rough heuristic to help us make some progress. But then you'll get these very immodest claims being made about, in order to establish what is required for the arguments to work. I'm just going to actually put this on here as well. Live reviewing this Bulldog debate with Matt Dillahunty. And then I got to put the link up for the damn thing. Right, let's carry on.
The theory is that fairies rigged a deck, that I'd get 10 royal flushes, both explain the data of me getting 10 royal flushes. It's likelier that I'm cheating because it has a higher prior probability. Next, one should look at the evidence. Evidence for a hypothesis is simply anything...
I'll say this as well. Like the examples that are often pointed to are often examples where there's very simple combinatoric problems to pump our intuitions about the legitimacy of the approach. So, for example, cases of counting cards, cases of coin flips, these are the sorts of cases that get appealed to where we can sort of like create a toy model and very clearly define what the empirical probability should be through understanding the combinatorics of the problem, right? So, an evenly dealt hand of cards, let's say, we know how many suits there are, we know the colors, we know all the faces of the cards. And so, if we assume everything's kind of like fair about that deck, like every card's identical other than those features that are printed that are changed, and everything's fair about the dealer, we can use the properties of the deck that we know numerically to quite rigorously define what's going on. Same with a fair coin, where it's just got the two, we model it as saying it's just got the two heads that it might, the two heads or tails, the two faces that it might land on. The problem is in jumping from a case like that, where yes, for these very simple cases, using these tools of probability can be legitimate, to jump into a case where it's much, much, much more ambiguous and poorly defined. Like, for example, imagine that you start saying, well, here's my, I either win the lottery or I don't win the lottery, so it's 50-50 or something like that, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Now, obviously, we know, and a strong Bayesian will also still make this case, we know that that isn't the correct probability. And again, we can more rigorously mathematicalize that by, looking at all the balls that are involved, the number of them that are being picked out, is it with replacement, without replacement, all sorts of things. And so we can have a kind of well understood numerical analysis of what our probability assignments should be. But what if we make it even more, what if we make it so it's not a combinatorial problem at all? So how about you've got a positive HIV test or something, right? Now what do you do about your prior for updating on, having a positive HIV test, given you actually have HIV, the specificity and the precision of the test? Well, there's no a priori method for you're defining that. What about human psychology? If I'm talking about an agent and a person and I'm judging what they might do, which is more analogous and similar to the case of God, what do I say? Do I say, let's pick someone random, Fart Panther, in the chat, and I say, well, look, there's two things Fart Panther might do today, or that, there's 10, here's Fart Panther's psychology. He's an outstanding guy. So he'd want to do good things. So he'll probably go for a walk in the park today, or he will do his laundry. And it's like 50-50. We'll just apply the principle of indifference. Like, I can't get anything good out of that, because the actual number of things that he might do is way different to that. I don't know about his life. I've not sat down with a pair of binoculars watching him every weekend to see what sorts of things he actually does, to have any kind of a clear idea of that. It's just, it's a Rorschach test. And then the problem with that Rorschach test, that the Rorschach test of whatever story that you're going to tell about your intuitions or whatever, is that the people who are telling these stories are not coming to these things without the evidence in the first place. They already have thought about these arguments. They have some idea of the discourse. They have some idea of where they want to situate themselves in the discourse. They have some idea narratively of where they want to situate themselves, the stories that they want to say about how rational they are and how they want to be perceived by an audience in debates. Like, there's all of these factors that are going on that inform the way that we're going to come to think the sorts of things that we think about a prior probability, and we'll push around and push our intuitions. So it's too different and wild a case to even for it to even be useful, I think.
That's likelier if the hypothesis is true than if it's false. Now, this isn't just my conjecture. Mathematicians have shown that if some event is likelier given a hypothesis is truth than its falsity, then that event makes the hypothesis more likely. This became formalized through something called Bayes' theorem. For example, suppose that you want to figure out
Bayes' theorem, first formalized by Laplace in
cheating in poker. And suppose you think the odds that I'd cheat are low, maybe 1 in 10,000. Thus, in order for the evidence to establish that I'm cheating with more than 50% probability, it must be that my stream of luck is so unlikely that it's more than 10,000 times likelier it would happen by cheating than by chance. This is the method applied in science and history.
I actually think that this is wrong on both accounts. I mean, he's going to give some examples, but I mean, I think that you can, again, approximately like shoot the shit, saying something like inference to the best explanation is approximated best by some form of Bayes. I don't think that's right. I mean, look, the vast majority of the history of the sciences in the past 100 years has been defined by frequentist methods that were established by Ronald Fisher in his research methods for scientists in the 1920s, and a bunch of the tests and things that came out of that. So that is, that like literally just not right that this is what's used. It is used in science, but it's not only or mostly what's used in science. I mean, there are deductive arguments that are occasionally given in scientific context. There's also all sorts of irrational forces that shape and change the sorts of things that people do in the sciences. We were discussing the other day about how discoveries in optics and our ability to see stuff in the sky meant that we could see, a whole bunch of extra rocks and shit that we couldn't see that were about the same size as Pluto. And so, it became really inconvenient. The choice was that you're either going to have to admit a whole bunch of things, and there'll be like millions, thousands of planets, or you kind of like refine your criteria back a little bit, and you'll have fewer planets, and it will seem more sort of like the status quo when we think about the solar system, and we don't want to have to remember too many things. And also for funding purposes, we want to remember fewer things. You find the same thing dotted all throughout history. Another example that I've been looking into a lot is why Lavoisier's chemical theories were preferred over Priestley's theories of phlogiston and calx. A lot of it had to do with Lavoisier being a fantasy Frenchman from Paris University, and also the political views of Priestley, and his lab got trashed for political reasons. It's not the case that you just have people ratiocinating with Bayes' theorem and observing stuff. It is the case that you have this stuff sort of happening as well. But science is a really complicated human process that's bound up in all sorts of social concerns and practices and cultural, historic things that are happening. Same with the practice of history. There's all sorts of different debates around hermeneutics and how to apply them to, interpreting ancient texts. There's all sorts of different ways of handling evidence and methods that people have had. Of course, you can say that you can make the argument that everyone should be using Bayes' theorem, but to say that is what everyone's doing is just wrong, right?
After the discovery of dark matter, scientists believe dark matter exists because light from faraway galaxies seems to be bent as if affected by gravity, but the places giving off the gravitational field don't release any light. In addition, the speed of galactic rotation seemed to indicate...
See, I don't know a lot about the actual history of this. Maybe it was the case that Bayes' theorem was used, maybe it wasn't. I think you could tell a story about making sense of what happened through Bayes' theorem where it wasn't actually used, right, as well. like, for example, you could point to say like the establishment of Einstein's field equations definitely didn't happen in this way. Like, no one applied Bayes' theorem. Instead, what happened was kind of quite complicated, and there was like a lot of resistance to his theories because it overturned a lot of stuff that people were invested in and believed in. There was a lot of like people gathering evidence, not being sure, kind of like maybe tentatively changing their minds, having debates, but no one explicitly like plugged this into Bayes' theorem. So you could say, I can model what happened by telling this story about justification. That's like, there's the likelihood ratio preferred Einstein's field equations, whatever. And you can make that true, of course, but that just isn't what actually happened or how we got to where we got to. So you can't say that this is what scientists did to get us to the theories we have that work, because it isn't what they did do. You could still make an argument that this is what they should be doing going forward as well. Like that, those two aren't, one doesn't entail the falsity of the other, but you can't point to these examples where it wasn't actually used. I'm trying hard to think of actual examples in the sciences where this has been used. There are some. I think the cracking of the Enigma code is going to be like one of them, and another application would be for batch manufacturing, and between batch manufacturing of like ammunition in the Second World War and figuring out which batches might contain like bad bullets and rounds that bit, like, and that was quite successful. It improved manufacturing capacity, it was more cost efficient, all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, Shasset, this doesn't engage with what I said. So observations made us choose between one or the other. But what I'm saying is, I don't like did anyone actually compare likelihood ratios or put it in Bayes' theorem or anything like that? What actually happened historically to get us to change our minds? That's the question. And it could be that. I'm just saying I don't know in this case, but I know in a lot of other cases it wasn't that happened.
More mass than we could observe. Scientists came to believe thus that there was dark matter, kind of invisible matter that exerted gravity, because it explained these otherwise puzzling facts about the world. It wasn't first demonstrated that dark matter is possible, nor was there any kind of direct experimental verification. Scientists instead believed it because the supposition that...
I kind of think that I think that something about that is fishy as well, where what dark matter is something that is operationalized against experimental evidence. So I would say that what dark matter means is a thing that is operationalized in a particular kind of way against experimental findings. There's a way of discussing that that's like, what does it mean to have modified that? Does it mean so there's one way of talking, that's to say, I've forgotten the term, retroduction or something like that. There's some word. There's some way of talking that's to say der of the things, we inferred an invisible thing. Now there's another way of looking at this, which is to say we modified our discourse. There were some observations that was difficult for us to make sense of in the current discourse that we had, because the discourse is operationalized against our experimental findings, right? And there's a way of looking at that, which would be to say, what we did was we come up with a new, we got rid of some terms, we introduced a new term, and that new term is operationalized against the experimental findings in a different sort of way. And again, I think that's a slightly different way of looking. Now you could say, and I can make sense of this using Bayesian apparatus, but I think that, I don't know what the fuck my point is. Who cares?
There was invisible matter. Wasn't wildly unlikely in terms of its prior probability, and it explained the evidence very well.
I have no
Similar
idea.
things apply to the discovery that Hannibal used elephants to cross the Alps. This wasn't first demonstrated to be possible, but was believed because it was the best explanation of written records of Hannibal crossing the Alps and soil samples containing large feces deposits. Now, people criticize this method by saying that we have no way of precisely deciding upon the priors and the degree of the update. But to apply this method, you don't need highly precise priors, only rough approximations. I don't know the exact prior probability of evolution, but there's clearly enough evidence to believe it. So now let's apply this methodology to God. First, consider the prior probability of God. The prior probability...
I have literally no fucking idea what that is. I don't even know. Like, as I've said before, I don't know what it would mean. Like, if I'm meant to imagine myself before having any data, I can't even think in that situation. I don't have thoughts. I don't speak language. I can't make sense of the question, what is the probability you assign to God's existence? I only learned about probabilities when I was about 16 years old. You know, so it's just nonsensical to me. Now, in terms of me now understanding like what I'm being asked here, I cannot assign a value to that because I don't know what I'm even supposed to be thinking. Like, what even is the question? How many times do I think God exists versus doesn't? How you asking me a question about how much I'm willing to bet in certain circumstances? Because that is again how Bayesians motivate Bayesianism is by talking about these cases of placing rational bets, right? Am I being asked to make a choice about something or not? So.
How likely a view is before considering the evidence is influenced by various factors. Two major ones are simplicity and non-arbitrariness. The theory that the world is infinite in size has a higher prior than the theory that it's exactly...
I think that's just not true. I actually think that's kind of crazy. Like, this is the Swinburne simplicity stuff, which is like, you know, 0 or infinity are simpler values. And you know, this has never been proven correct in history again. You know, like all the examples that Swinburne appeals to are ones where it was wrong in the past. And I don't know why you would think it's simpler. I don't know why you wouldn't just think that that's as arbitrary as any other value. If you're taking this strong view of the principle of indifference that he's going to want to apply in other circumstances, then I don't know why those would be special values. I just don't know. And I also think then when you ask Matthew about things like simplicity, he goes with non-standard views of simplicity for other scientific fields, which again are, you know, views of simplicity that are to do with computational complexity and things like that. And instead he has like a special view of simplicity, which is how simple things would be to describe in an ideal language a word of which cannot be spoken and is not known, like, which I just find completely like it's very convenient. It's very convenient that Matthew knows what the sentences of this ideal language are like and how simple things are in it, because I can't speak this ideal language.
10 quadrillion light years across, because infinity is a less arbitrary size. Similarly, as Occam's razor...
Oh, yeah. Look, I'm beating up on Matthew because he's talking, but I agree overall here. I am on Matthew's side. You know, I think he's better than Dillahunty here.
Us. We should not multiply entities without necessity.
Yeah, I think in terms of what Rich is saying here, it's like saying 100 simpler than 27 because it feels less random. You know, like go and ask a Mesopotamian if 16 or 10 is less arbitrary. I mean, that's an empirical question, I think, but you know, you ask someone who's trained in a different base number system, like I think that they will say that the points there are points in their system where things will feel less random or less arbitrary than others. Now, obviously, to be fair to what Matthew's saying here, I think he would say no to both. He would say, you know, because those are both natural numbers, they're equally as arbitrary as each other, but infinity and 0 are like these special numbers because they have different properties. But I think it's the same thing where it's just like ends of a scale, sort of. You know, which cardinality of infinity we're talking about? You know, and
that's why, absent a good reason, you shouldn't think that there's an uncaused teapot between here and Mars. Note that as the atheist philosopher Jonathan Schaffer argues, Occam's razor should be about the number of unexplained or fundamental entities rather than the total number of entities that exist. Otherwise, solipsism would be the simplest theory.
I think it should be about both, and I think that saying solipsism should be a simpler theory is just question begging against solipsism. If it's a simpler theory, just go with it. Like,
because it just posits your mind rather than a big universe. By this,
like I think if those are the rules that you're playing for the game, like maybe you should be a solipsist. Like all you've done there is said, what, solipsism's absurd, therefore solipsism's absurd, and if we permitted it, it would beat my theory. Therefore, we need this particular rule for the way that we count things in terms of simplicity. And by the way, an infinite number of spatio-temporally disconnected universes exist, right? If it's sort of okay to just hand wave away certain theories as being obviously wrong, like to reject the methodology, well, then why don't we just reject all of Matthew's methodology because it leads to insane conclusions? Like something has gone wrong with the methodology if we need to get to God by way of an infinite number of spatio-temporally disconnected universes, you know?
Like theism, which I use to mean that there is a perfect God, does very well. It posits only one fundamental entity, a mind totally without limit. Because this mind is unlimited, nothing restricts its power or awareness, so it can do anything and it knows everything. Once it's omnipotent and omniscient, it will act to do the right thing, because a perfectly rational person would come to see the irrationality of immorality.
I think that this is a nonsense as well. Like, I don't think it even makes sense, this talk of like the only reasonable way I can interpret what Matthew's saying here, given like my understanding of the world, is like a perfectly rational agent would come to agree with me about value judgments. But like, why think that? It's just completely kind of okay. An infinitely rational being would be right about the value judgments. But who's to say that their value judgments would be the ones that you're saying they would make? Which are the ones that they would have to make in order to decide to create a good world in what you're going to say is good. It also just seems a bit of a mess to me in terms of it doesn't seem like rational to create a world like this if you're a perfect being existing sans nothing. Even if you're going to say like consciousness is good so it do good things.
Just as if you're rational, you won't be racist, as racism is irrational, and you.
I actually don't think racism is irrational. There's all sorts of cases, there's all sorts of circumstances under which racism is rational. And also Matthew supports race scientists like Rich, Matthew's got a few posts about eugenics and Richard Hanania and stuff like that, where, they're all in favor of talking about the races. Some people might consider that a sort of scientific salad dressing for racism that sits atop of a utilitarian worldview.
And you won't arbitrarily privilege your present self over your future self. A perfectly rational, limitless mind wouldn't arbitrarily privilege anyone over anyone else, and thus would be morally perfect. This also shows the error of the claim that belief in God is like belief in fairies or unicorns. Fairies and unicorns are very complicated things.
God is a very complicated thing. God has divine simplicity, but fairies and unicorns have fairy unicorn simplicity. Fairy unicorn simplicity is such that whatever the values that fairies and unicorns take for certain things are simpler because those are the rules of fairy unicorn simplicity.
They have many distinct properties with no core explanation, and there's no evidence for them. In contrast,
the thing is, under like, again, a ratio senator view of the world, there's all sorts of circumstances that you can tell stories about where racist actions would be the rational ones, right? Like, you can set up bets where a racist action is going to lead to you winning that bet. Just like Matthew bites a bullet in the case of the utility monster. I shouldn't say bites a bullet, but just like Matthew accepts the conclusion of his principles that, you should sacrifice your babies to the utility monster. Similarly, you could create like a racism world where you got to be like a neo-Nazi and that leads to the most utility and tell a story about it. And he would agree that that's the thing that you've got to do, is the entailment of his views.
God is the simplest possible kind of mind, simply one without limit. The world has three kinds of things.
The world has three kinds of things. This quoit, this pen, and not this quoit or this pen.
Abstract objects like numbers, the material world, and minds. Now,
according to Matthew, of course, and look, I don't know. This is why I wouldn't do a debate like this, though, is because I guess there's not the room to introduce the nuance that's required for anyone to get a good idea of these topics. It's probably, it's probably good for Matthew to do this in a sense. He'll get a bit of visibility for himself and can make himself look smarter than Dillahunty, which is all great. But that's just so according to you, that. I mean, that's massive amounts of disagreement on this.
Now, minds can't reduce to the physical world because no amount of...
I wouldn't even say the world is fundamentally comprised of any types of things. I don't have a fucking clue what the world is fundamentally comprised of. I even know what it means for the world to be fundamentally comprised of anything. I got no fucking idea what that even means. I'll tell you about my world. My world is made up of walls and sandwiches and shoes and people and love and hate and God and atheism and fucking the Reform Party and immigration policy and football games and jobs and that's what my world is made up of. I don't know what it's fundamentally made up of. I don't even know what I'm being asked if someone asks me that. Now, there are people who will disagree with me, who will take different views, right? There are people who take a more metaphysical approach. They will be monists of some kind. They might be idealists. Matthew's ruled out idealism because idealism is crazy. But, every time Matthew says a view is crazy, play in your head him saying an infinite number, in fact, Beth2 infinity of people exist because David Lewis says so. The other thing here is there's reductive physicalists, right? Reductive physicalists will say whatever the hell they've got to say, that there's some fundamental physical substance that, maybe that's the grand wave function, something. I don't know. I don't actually think it. I don't believe this, but fair enough. These views are on the table, and typically, if you're arguing with atheists, they're not going to agree with that. They're not going to agree that there are fundamentally three kinds of different fundamental things. Numbers, just I'm not even going to get into it. But there's so many different views out there that it's just if that is one of your premises, it's going to be so easy for someone to disagree with you on that. And of course, there's more that you can say about it, but it just frustrates me that such a controversial thing is such a crucial part of your argument.
Matter alone is enough by itself to produce a mind. As the philosopher Frank Jackson famously...
Yeah, I mean, if you believe it all reduces to set theory, I get what you're saying, the dudes, but that's my views of mathematics are not that it reduces to anything. I just think there's different discourses. Counting in base 10 is one of those discourses. Doing set theory is something. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
We argued. Well, reading textbooks could allow you to learn every physical fact about the world. For instance, you could learn the laws of physics from a book. It wouldn't allow you to learn everything about minds, like what it's like to see red if you've never seen red. Thus, minds must not be purely physical, because textbooks can teach you every physical fact, but not...
Yeah, because physicalism is the view that reading English language words will make you see the color red. Physicalism is the view that if you read every true sentence about the universe, you'll see the color red.
Not every mental fact. But if minds are non-physical fundamental entities, a limitless mind is a very simple kind of thing. One category of fundamental reality...
I think it's so... What's my current actual response to Mary's room is that someone can't use the word red without a red thing playing a role in that story. So, the word red, according to me, is defined by a public activity, the use of a community of speakers who talk about red things. And so the only way to be a competent speaker of the language is to have the same red as someone else, right? So here's an experiment we can all participate in, according to me, right? See, like the timer over here where my mouse is, I'm going to say, you all tell me whether this is true or false. That's blue. And look, if you've got kids, we can play along at home, right? We can say, that's blue. Okay, now let's try another one. That's red, right? How about that? Is that red? No, everyone's like, no, that's not red. The only way I can make sense of someone being able to speak about red is if they've acquired a language and use a language in a way where they share the same red, they share the same linguistic activity. I don't mean qualitatively, I don't mean quantitatively, I mean the same red, the same verbal behavior, the same linguistic activity, right? So to even make sense for me of the Mary's Room thought experiment, for her to be able to even make sense of read sentences, to be a competent speaker of the language who can read sentences, she's going to have to know what red is in the first place. Now, there's this like divorce of qualia, which I think is nothing, and ordinary language, ordinary use of color words that's going to go on to try to motivate this. But I think the other thing, let's say I was still a reductive physicalist, and I don't consider myself a reductive physicalist at the moment, but how might I think about what Matthew's saying? I wouldn't think that reading English language sentences in a textbook, hay fever, would lead me to having an experience of red, right? You would think, it depends. Again, there's a number of views that you might take on propositions, propositional knowledge, all that sort of stuff. So you could know facts about, for example, all the places where red occurs geospatially in the universe or something. You could know facts about what it would mean to see red, but to see red wouldn't be entailed by you knowing all the physical facts. Like you'd have propositional knowledge, but you wouldn't have, the behavioral knowledge, the experiential knowledge, if that's even a thing. I don't even think that's really a right way of thinking about it, because you don't think of knowledge as like, you don't have knowledge of an experience. Like that's just a weird grammar. Like you have knowledge of complicated types of sentences. It's just a weird thing that philosophers do when they talk. Do I know I'm in pain? Do I know I'm seeing red? No, I just am seeing red. Like I'm looking at that blue thing. Do I know I'm seeing blue? It's not that I know or don't know. It's not that I doubt or, like I just do see blue, It's incredibly weird. Anyway, don't want to go down this rabbit hole.
Instantiated without limit. It also is distinctly non-arbitrary because it's completely without limit. Now, you don't have to think all of this is obviously true. It only needs to be plausible enough for theism to start with a somewhat reasonable prior probability. Dark matter didn't start with a very high prior, but it's reasonable to believe in because it had lots of evidence and its prior wasn't too low. So now let's turn to the evidence. In my view, there's a lot of evidence, more than I can list here.
Well, I guess the other thing to say is that, you only get away with saying that you think she doesn't see red because you can't properly imagine these circumstances. But if it truly is an entailment of physicalism, that learning all of the physical facts would entail the experience of red, then yes, obviously she would know what it's like to see red if she knew all the physical facts, because that would just be amongst the facts that she knew, right? So these sort of thought experiments are just stupid. They're vague, ambiguous. They rely on people having completely uninformed causal models of the way that human brains and language work, to create like little riddles that people get trapped in, where they can hide in the ambiguity of these riddles and stories. And what you think about those is entirely determined by what you think about the conclusions in the first place that the arguments are supposed to establish. It's just such a rubbish way. And I think not just a rubbish way of doing philosophy, it's like it's almost sneaky or disingenuous to like as if to just drop something like that as a premise when it's Brandolini's law now, like that the amount of detail someone has to go into to engage with that, unpack it, lay out all the relevant responses is so much longer than what it takes to just go, obviously we know because of the intuition we get through Mary's room that consciousness is non-physical.
Let me just discuss a few lines. First is the fine-tuning of the constants in physics, meaning the values that go into the equations of physics. Around 1980, physicists discovered that many of the constants are finely tuned, in the sense that they fall in an infinitesimal range that happens to be the only kind that can form complex structures. If the cosmological constant were a bit weaker, the universe would have collapsed in on itself right after the Big Bang. And if it were a bit stronger, every atom would have been ripped apart so that no two particles ever interacted. Luke Barnes, an influential physicist, calculated that the odds of getting finely tuned constants by chance are only...
Luke Barnes, an influential... so this is something that Matthew does in his debate presentation too, is he will say, atheist philosopher XYZ says, ABC. In Luke Barnes' case, does he go, Christian theoretical physicist and apologist Luke Barnes has argued that, no, he doesn't do that.
Only 1 part in 10 to the power of 136. That's about as unlikely as throwing a dart across the known universe and hitting a particular atom. Well, actually, that's about 40 orders of magnitude less likely, but who's counting? If there's a god of the sort I described, this fine-tuning is probable, or at the very least, not astronomically improbable. God, being good, wants valuable stuff to exist, so he'd set the constants to whatever value is needed for life. In contrast, on atheism, the odds are astronomically tiny. Thus, this...
Exactly. God loves finely tuned universes. He couldn't love anything else. He's limited in that way.
This is one line of evidence for theism. It's a fact that's likelier if there's a god than if there's no god. Atheists have lots of ways to try to explain this, and I can't hope to discuss them in detail, but if you want a lengthier rebuttal to the objections, check out my article, The Fine-Tuning Argument Simply Works. A second bit of evidence is consciousness itself. If there's a perfect god, he'd want to create conscious agents.
It's not above your... Sailor says, inferring God's properties makes no sense to me. Maybe it's above my head. It's not above your head, Sailor. It's because you are a truly pious religious man. You know the way. That's why. So you don't engage in such blasphemy.
Conscious agents are good things. However, if there's no God, then it's a surprise that consciousness exists at all. Why would particles moving around give rise to subjectivity?
Because you ask a question in a fucked up way. Give rise to subjectivity. You're thinking of like weird substances. Like you need to think of the human organism as an organism that acts and perceives. So when the story is in terms of the behavior of that organism with the integrated action of their nervous system, where their nervous system performs certain types of computations, then you can get, and you have this account of language that's to do with meaning as use and so forth. You get a picture of what's going on that's very... there's no mystery involved in that. Like that I, as a human, see because I use my eyes to see. There's all sorts of problems that go on. You're right that there are bad physicalist explanations of this. There's conceptually confused ways that people will engage with that problem, where they will try to then say, follow the path of the light, of the signal that's induced on nerves through the brain, and try to find a certain region where the image is presented to oneself, a sort of like weird in my view, Cartesian theatre sort of thing. I think that is the wrong way of thinking about this. I think that what it is for an organism to see is, that the integrated, it's for them to see a macroscopic behavior of the organism. If my eyes are gone, I ain't seeing. Similarly, if a bunch of my brain's gone, I also ain't seeing, because it's that whole thing working together that is what it is for me to see. There's only something as mysterious about what it is for me to see as there is something as mysterious about what it is for a camera to produce an image. The problem is that if you say that, then people start thinking of like, well, how does the subjectivity arise? You know, how does and it's like it's that thinking of the question that's messed up, because I'm showing you how light can get to a place, right? and create an image. But what light does is it comes to me as an organism, and I just respond to that. There's no presentation to a thing of subjectivity. There's no like little movie theater where images are presented. I can see an image in my visual field, like I can present an image to myself. but what it is for me to see is my activity as an organism as a whole.
This is especially so if you agree with the arguments I gave before.
Both I got the Wittgensteinians and the Thomists agreeing with me on this one,
showing that the material world alone isn't enough to produce consciousness by itself. Thus, to get consciousness on atheism, you need extra special consciousness laws, which are improbable.
No, you don't. To get consciousness on atheism and confused metaphysics, you need that.
A third line of evidence is the fact that the laws give rise to any life and anything of value. It would be much simpler for there to simply be a single particle that...
Confused according to me. I'm saying confused because I'm frustrated. Like, there are people with different views on this.
Never does anything. Or for there to be two particles circling around each other for eternity. Those studying cellular automata, dots moving around, have discovered that with a random set of laws, you're much likelier to get either total chaos or simple patterns that don't produce any structure than to get the kind of stable order needed for life. This even leads the mathematician Johann Squires in a published paper to propose that we may live in the simplest possible interesting world, interesting in the technical sense of producing complex structure. If there's a God, it makes sense that our world would have the balance of...
Yeah, the problem is that the sorts of constraints that are being put on the game of life is different to the types of constraints that are being put on fine-tuned universes. So for a fine-tuned universe, you have varying these constants, but you also have varying laws. Well, depending on how people count selectively. And not only do you have varying them individually, but you have varying them together and what the variations of them together even mean. And the point is that entire region, we actually just don't know for most of it what it is. What apologists tend to do is say, oh, well, it's good enough for us to understand for some region of what we can understand that wouldn't permit life like us. Okay, it wouldn't permit life like us. Would it not permit life? Well, we can't say, because we can't actually, we're not come to it with some kind of good criteria for what it would mean for there to be life. And so we can't actually even evaluate whether there would be exotic forms of life or different forms of life. Then we got these psychophysical laws that Matthew's saying exist and need to be varied. And this thing called consciousness, which is a metaphysical different, is consciousness sufficient for something to be a life form if it has consciousness? Then you got, Nielsen Barbu's electrons in love sort of issues arising and cropping up. So, you need to just leave out all the details that you want to leave out in order to get it to work in the way that Matthew wants it to work. It's so much that his presentation presents it as if all this stuff is so certain, but it isn't at all. It's all speculative and vague and unprecise. And stop thinking it just okay, Matt Dillahunty, you're not thinking hard enough about this, so think harder. Okay, now stop right where I tell you to stop. Don't go thinking beyond that boundary of the epistemically illuminated space of the combinatorial possibilities of changing different constants in our theoretical physics models.
Simplicity and complexity, it give rise to an interesting world. In contrast, in a godless world, either a world that never produces any conscious life at all and just has particles moving around in highly repetitive patterns, or one that's random chaos, is far, far more likely than this world. The fourth bit of evidence is the fact that you exist. Now, this one's a little bit complicated, so strap in. Your existence... Existence can give you evidence for many things. For example, your existence gives you evidence that your parents didn't use effective contraception. But can it give you evidence for God's existence? Well, as I've argued in a published paper, your existence is likelier. Oh, I just lost my place. Your existence is likelier if more people exist, just as it's likelier that your card would be drawn from a deck if all the cards are drawn and if just one card is drawn. Now, here's where things get weird. Because the number of possible people is a very large infinite, as the philosopher David Lewis showed.
This frustrates me as well, that Matthew wants to often say it's Beth2 infinity, and then he just says why, because David Lewis showed it. Again, if you're making these sorts of arguments, you should be actually making that argument. Like, it's such a key part of the case that he wants to make, that he should be showing his work in, not just saying David Lewis said so there's Beth2 infinite, modally disconnected realities. Fucking even the metaphysics of possible worlds, like that's just brought in as if it's like uncontentious to just bring in some particular conception of modal metaphysics and possible worlds, just because, how is this being got to? Well, in natural language, there are modal adverbs that people use. What describes the fact that there are modal adverbs that people use? Oh, it must be truth maker semantics, and what corresponds to make our sentences that contain modal adverbs true. It must be it must be existing possible worlds that correspond, because obviously meanings are sort of like phenomenal experiences that are privately had, because truth app sentences express propositions, and that's what a proposition is, some kind of entity that corresponds to reality. And compositional semantics is true, so these legitimate these propositions are comprised of parts which have individual meanings, and then for the modal adverb part of that sentence to make sense, there must be correspondence to possible worlds and accessibility relations between worlds and things like that. Like, there's so much that needs to be brought in the background to even be like using this in the way that's being used. Again, to me, it's nothing more than like here's a bunch of shit you can't possibly respond to, that I'm just going to assume and declare victory because this is how academic philosophers talk, and you can get published on this in academic philosophy. If anything, to me, this should be an indictment of academic philosophy, not a it is also a criticism of Matt Dillahunty.
For your existence,
or show that, argue that, because this is what I'm saying, is that if you don't buy into this view of propositions and language, like I'm a meaning as use guy, I'm a behaviorist. I don't think that. I don't know no one's ever given me an account of correspondence that makes any sense to me. Like, what corresponds to what? A proposition. Well, what's a proposition? How does it correspond? What does it mean for it to correspond? Oh, it means that it's true. Okay, well, how do I know if it's true? Well, by acting on it. So what role does the correspondence play? Well, it corresponds if I act on it and I find out that it's, all of this stuff doesn't make sense to me. Okay, well, the compositional semantics, how does that work for languages that don't have the same grammatical particles as English language has? Does the true propositional language have the copula or not? Do you say the wall is red, and is that expressed in the complex of a proposition? Or do you say the wall reds and predicate the verb of the wall, as you do in a lot of other languages? What do you do with all these tribal languages that don't have those grammatical constructs? Or they're just excluded? What's in the proposition? I think there's so many issues with these views of language, and yet so much is done by buying into these views of language. To to the point where people are just happy to like go off on tangents about spatio-temporally disconnected metaphysical worlds just because they think, you know, adverbs in the English language have to correspond to something. Have you considered the correspondence theory of falsity, which says a false bearer is false if and only if it corresponds to reality via a false-making relation? I think that that is correct.
To be likely, it must be that a very large infinity worth of people get created, which is likely or given God.
No. Correspondence is what exists when no one believes it. So if there's a problem with these sorts of questions, the problem is, so you're asking a person who's a speaker of a language to what they would say in a scenario where they imagine that they don't exist. Now, obviously, the speaker of the language, you're not asking nobody from nowhere. You're not asking the universe itself. You're not asking metaphysics God. You're asking a person. So you're sort of embedding the person's imagination in a context where they don't exist, but you're asking them to produce a description of it. So it's still them giving you a description, right? They're saying, yeah, sure, if I didn't exist, tables and chairs and atoms and so forth would exist, right? So does that refute the idea that all languages are activities possessed by people? No, because what it produced for you was a language produced by a person, you know, in a scenario where they're supposed to be imagining a fictitious story. So I don't think that this case can establish that. Like what would be required to establish that would be to actually take off your mind and exist from no point of view and see what type of answers are given. And that's just, it's a nonsensical scenario. You can't engage with that. Don't look, it's never good. Hume shit. No, Hume's pretty good on a lot of things. Racism, not so good, you know. I'm not a big fan of all this stuff, but he's all right, I think. Matt shit. I don't think Matt shit. Jesus shit. I don't think Jesus shit. I love Jesus. Love his moral message. Love following Jesus. And he is not God. Whereof I cannot speak, thereof I remain silent. And well, God's shit. Never said that. The reason that I'm addressing this sort of thing that Matthew's doing is because I see it as the most impious blasphemy to reduce God to a pseudo-scientific hypothesis. That's the reason that I care about this stuff, is because I want people to engage with religion and go and feed homeless people and make the world a better place. I don't want them like engaging, like reducing God to some like fine tuner, a snap of the fingers and then no longer required.
God than atheism. So your existence gives you infinitely strong evidence that the number of people that got created is the most people that could have been created, which is likelier if there's God than if there's no God. To illustrate this, let's consider an analogy. Suppose that a coin is tossed. If it comes up heads, one person is created. If it comes up tails, 10 people get created. After getting created, you should think it's 10 times likelier it came up tails, because that makes it 10 times likelier that you get.
Right. So in that scenario where you knew all that and you knew these conditions, sure, right, that would be right. There's a difference between the argument that Matthew makes with a self-indicating assumption. The difference is that there's some kind of bait and switch, in my view, that goes on with his appeal to I exist. So he wants to appeal to I exist because this idea of the self as like a reified thing is like a special metaphysical entity. The problem is that literally any observation would give him this update that he wants. Because literally any observation is better predicted by modal realism than some specific hypothesis. Okay. So why does he choose the self rather than any observation? Now, I talked to him about this and we went like back and forth and never really got around to the actual point. The problem as I see it is that yes, you're only going to get that update once, that big update, as it were. But why are you getting, like the question I'm asking is, why are you getting it from this rather than anything? Why are you not getting it from, I see my overgrown big toenail, I infer infinitely many overgrown toenails exist of different sizes, and toenails of different sizes are not toenails, right? I think it's because there's something in people's, it sounds less crazy to talk about the self, or it legitimizes it because the self is like a special metaphysical thing. Might be right, might be wrong about that. What's the other problem, as I see it with this reasoning, is that he's taken modal realism to be an expression of every single possible state of affairs, and then he's comparing that to what he should be comparing that to is a catch-all hypothesis, which is the sum of every independently possible state of affairs that isn't all of them taken together as like modal realism, right? The problem is that the catch-all hypothesis and modal realism itself should be mirror images of each other, because every single possible subset will be contained in the catch-all hypothesis, and that will just be what modal realism is. And why is that a problem? Because the way in which Matthew uses the principle of indifference, that should basically nuke whatever update, like significantly massive update he thinks he's getting. There's that many hypotheses on the table here, right? That it's going to correspondingly minimize the prior that he's given to modal realism, such that I don't think it's really doing anything. And I think all the same problems as before are going to come up in terms of, like, how do we even assign this? Like, what are we even talking about? I don't actually know.
Get created. But now suppose that if it came up tails, instead infinity people would get created. Well, now by the same logic, you should think that tails is...
Oliver Brown asks, should we believe in God? My answer to that is that depends whether it will make you a better follower of God or not.
Infinitely likelier than heads. If 10 people existing makes your existence 10 times likelier, then infinity people existing makes your existence infinity times likelier. I have one final case, but first I'll need to explain something about infinity. As mathematicians have firmly established, there are bigger and smaller infinities. The smallest infinity is called Aleph null, and it's the maximum number of people that you could fit into one single...
The smallest infinity is called your mum when she steps on the scales.
...universe. But the number of possible people is a much bigger infinity. An infinite multiverse could have a number of people that could never fit in a single universe, even one infinite in size. Now, let's consider the last case. A coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads...
Olex Alex says Matthew's opening is made up of like 14 different moving parts, which could be talked about for hours on their own. I've got no clue how he wants... Yeah, well, this is the point, is that he obviously doesn't want Matt to be able to respond to any of this, right? And that's the game, and that's why I often don't like what rationalists do, because they're not playing a fair game. They're, they like to pretend that they're better than everyone else. They're just reasonable and rational. But this is a type of dominance display. It's like, look at all the shit I know. And like everyone like bow to me because I'm so much fucking smarter. And it is a debate tactic. I know there's a piece on benthams.substack.com, and there's no such thing as debate tactics. But it's a debate tactic of bringing up so much crap that your opponent cannot possibly address and focus on it all. That's what you do if you're opening, right? Because then what he's going to have to do, Matt Dillahunty, it would seem, is present back, responding to some of the points that Matthew's made. But if he does that, he's already on the back foot. So he's going to have to present his own case. But then the problem is going to become that then Matthew's going to say, well, this, and this has gone unresponded to. And he said so much that there will always be something that's gone unresponded to. And then he can say, so I win, sort of thing. And that's why this way of engaging is just like a nonsense sort of power display more than anything. And I just find it not productive, not useful for... Now, arguably, I'm partly on board with that, because I do think that Dillahunty is like a little bit too big for his boots, too dogmatic. And so I think that what Matthew's doing, as I was saying at the start, is displaying some of those things and, showing a sort of like irony, a sort of hypocrisy in the types of things that someone like Matt will say about being anti-religious dogmatism, but then being, one of the biggest kinds of religious dogmatism that there is on the other hand. But I also think that there's a disingenuousness to pretending that this is some kind of like gold standard rationality reasoning when actually it's sort of unfair debate tactics. I just realized that I ain't monetized this video. I got to monetize it. It got 110 people watching. Get some ads in your system.
Aleph null, the smallest infinity, people get created. If it comes up tails, a much bigger infinity worth of people get created. Upon being created, you should think the coin came up tails. It's infinitely likelier that you'd get created if the coin...
Oriel Brown says, I've been toying with the idea that God is a supermassive black hole and we are on the inside of the hole lately. I have been toying with your mum's hole lately.
Coin came up tails than heads, because infinitely more people get created by tails than heads. You might doubt that your existence...
This is what I'm talking about. I only gave 4 arguments. I didn't give 14. Yes, each of them has meant no. Right? Each of those arguments has contentious premises, right? You even introduce for those premises, like David Lewis says so, right? David Lewis says so. How many premises does David Lewis give in his argument, right? There's probably in total about, I would say, upwards of 100 contentious claims that are a part of the argument that's being made here if you were to map the whole tree out. And of course, even for each of those, you could potentially ask for justification. And that's not in like a dialectical trolling sense. That's in the sense that they will be philosophically contentious positions that are hotly contested and there's much debate about. So I think that it's a little bit, I don't know what to say to that. Like, sure, you're like, I only gave 4. You know that the complexity of what you're proposing is more than as if you just gave like 4 very simple statements to evaluate or something like that. And that's the point of the objection that's being raised.
Existence is likelier if more people exist, as the argument suggests. But this must be wrong. To see this, imagine one person is created and then a coin is...
No, there's not just 2 contentious claims, Matthew. There's upwards of hundreds of contentious claims. Like, the stuff that you believe is incredibly peculiar. Like, there's no other way of putting it.
Flipped. And if it comes up tails, 9 other people get created. Suppose you learn that you get created, but you...
Name 5 in the anthropic argument. Firstly, there's your assumptions that we should be using Bayesian reasoning, right? So then you're going to have all the premises that go into like a Dutch book argument or something like that in terms of justifying that. Then what you're going to have is your argument for something like a principle of indifference that you're going to be applying for getting priors that are assignable. What you're going to also be having is some kind of claim about modal realism, unpacking what it is, why we should be taking that seriously as a hypothesis whatsoever. Like, what does it even mean? Oh, come on. Do you know what? Not an assumption, not a premise. Yeah, not fucking permitted in the chat. How about that? There we go.
You don't know your birth rank. Then you're told that you're the first person. Because the odds that you'd be the first...
You can go and... I'll tell you what you can do. You can go and you can make a post saying, Nathan Ormond has rationally committed rational crimes, and then go and shoot up a school with the Zizians. Make sure you get the low IQ kids, though. Like, fucking hell.
Person, or only 1 in 10 if there are 10 people. Well, they're 100% if there's only 1 person. Unless you start out thinking that 10 people existing makes your existence 10 times likelier, you get the result that the odds of a coin coming up heads before it's been flipped are 10/11ths rather than 50%. But this is ridiculous. Fair coins come up heads half the time. If there's a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet, you should think there's a 50% chance that it will come up heads. Worse, we can get even more absurd results by changing around the numbers, so that you end up arbitrarily certain of improbable chancy events. Like that you'll get many royal flushes in poker, so long as if you don't get many royal flushes in poker, lots of people get created. In short, then, it's been conclusively demonstrated that so long as before flipping a coin, you should think there's a 1/2 chance that it will come up heads, it must be that your existence is X times likelier if there are X times as many candidates for being your present self. Now note, there are many more arguments for the idea that your existence gives you evidence that there are more people. I've compiled a list of 27 of these arguments, in fact. I'm happy to discuss many of the others if Matt is doubtful of this principle.
Fort Panther says, am I sure Matthew's bad faith in this moment? I think he's honestly convinced of what he's saying, but I think he's lost in the source, and I ain't got time for it, is my position on that. I think he's not being bad faith in the sense that he genuinely believes that stuff. I just think he's lost in the source.
But if you think your existence is likelier if more people exist, and infinitely likelier if infinity people exist, then
I'll even say this. I'll even say he is technically correct in what he's saying, but in being technically correct, he's missing what's being communicated. So like he's going to say, well, that's not technically a premise. And it's like, yeah, it's not a premise, but the question becomes like, you know, for example, like you could give an argument with two premises where the claims, you know, two premises and a conclusion, where the claims that you make just pack in a whole bunch of like crazy shit, right? Well, I mean, that's exactly what I actually claim is kind of going on. So then when someone's like, that's wild, there's like hundreds of background assumptions to get this to work. And then they're like, but that's only two premises in the argument. And then you're like, list them now. And then they start unpacking the sorts of things that you have to believe for this to work. And then you go, well, that's not in the actual premises. And it's like, well, yeah, it's not actually in the premise, right? Okay, sure, it's unstated, it's an unstated assumption. Like, who cares how we taxonomize the thing? The point is that in order to believe this thing, you got to be on board with all this stuff. Or if, you know, unless you already believe, you're not going to believe this stuff unless you already believe that stuff, right? Believing this other stuff should be the upshot of believing that stuff. Depends on how you model it. Someone could get banged in the head and just randomly believe in a particular kind of modal metaphysics or something like that. It's just like, so it's not that it's dishonest. It's like deflectionary. You know, it's like someone who cares about clarity and truth doesn't do that. What they do is they don't focus on the most minor way possible that they can be right. They recognize a way in which it's been articulated that they have made a mistake. And if they think that they've still got a point even in light of that, then they highlight that point. They don't focus on being right in the most minor way possible, if that makes sense.
And from the fact that you exist, you should think with certainty that there are infinite people. But this doesn't just stop at infinity. As we saw in the above example, you're likelier to exist if a bigger infinity of people exist than a smaller infinity. Thus, you should think that the number of people that exist is the very most that there could be. Whatever the maximum infinity worth of people that there could be is, that's how many people exist. Otherwise, only 0% of possible people exist, and your existence is infinitely unlikely. So far, we've shown that there's a giant infinity worth of people. Once again, this fits well with theism. A limitless perfect God would want to create a giant infinity worth of people to give a good life to as many people as possible. Thus, he'd be expected to make a huge multiverse containing...
I think Supercritical Snake also has a point here about, I'm not actually so sure that in terms of likelihood ratios, put in look, in decision theory, and this is what's a mess as well, like that, you know, people like Hayek have argued about why we shouldn't be using infinities in decision theory anyway. So I think Matthew's inclusion of infinities in the likelihood ratios is going to violate various arguments that have been given by people as well. And I agree, I don't actually know that adding higher infinities as your hypothesis on the likelihood ratio is going to boost the statistical prediction. So I think there's probably a few things going wrong there. But
an enormous infinity worth of people. In contrast, if there is no God, even if there's a multiverse, it's highly unlikely to be big enough to contain the most people that there could be, which is, remember, an infinity of people too large to fit in a single universe and more than the number of numbers. None of the existing multiverse models have enough people to make your existence anything but infinitely unlikely. Such views also have the problem that they undermine induction, but unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss that issue in detail. Now, this was all a bit technical, so let me give the two-sentence synopsis. Warning, these are long sentences. If anything other than the most people that there could be exists, because each infinity is infinitely bigger than smaller infinities, then only 0% of possible people exist, and your existence is infinitely unlikely. Therefore, from the fact that you exist, you should conclude that the number of people that exists is the most that it could be. But given that there could be a giant infinity worth of people, too many to fit in one universe or in any but the most gerrymandered of atheist multiverses, that gives you strong evidence for the existence of a good God who wants to create with no limits on how much he can create. Laid out more succinctly, the 3 steps are: 1, your existence is X times likely.
People say, I bet Matthew is never a true atheist. I don't think that's right. He was he was at a time, I think, genuinely convinced of atheism, and he was, going in like Discord chat rooms, debating theists quite frequently and vehemently. Now, I do not. Oh, you meant it as a joke. Okay, fair enough. I think he is genuinely convinced of the things that he says and believes at the minute. So that's fair enough. I don't think that he was never a true atheist or that he never understood the arguments against these views. I think he did. I increasingly find it frustrating when I can find instances of Matthew raising objections in the past that I sometimes see him ignoring now. But that's neither here nor there, Like, I think he's sincere.
Clear if there are X times as many people. 2, if that's right, then you should think the maximum number of people there could be exists. And 3, the maximum number of people existing is likelier given theism than atheism. Now, this is a complicated argument, so I encourage you to read about it more. I have an article called The Ultimate Guide to the Anthropic Argument that explains it in more detail. It's convinced some very competent philosophers, and at least one atheist mathematician takes it very seriously. So if you're thinking it's dumb for a very simple reason, probably you're misunderstanding it. Here I've presented 4 bits of evidence that point to God's existence: the fine-tuning of the constants, the existence of consciousness, the fact that the universe has laws capable of giving rise to complex structures without devolving to random chaos, and the fact that you exist out of the infinite number of possible beings, which is only likely if a God of limitless creative power exists. I've additionally argued that theism has a high likelihood even before looking at the evidence, because it explains so much, so well, it's likely to be true. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the debate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. All right, we are going to switch over to hear Matt's opening. Matt, are you ready?
I believe I'm... Whoops.
I believe in God. He's convinced.
Is my audio on?
Yep.
Then I'm...
Also, what's going on with the Dillahunty mustache? Unfortunately, I didn't have time to grow a mustache to mock Dillahunty today, but maybe for a future episode.
All right, go ahead.
All right, huge thank you to everybody for tuning in, and to Matthew for doing this, and to Arden for producing and hosting it as well.
Here's a question, though. I think Dillahunty had some rule about only doing debates if he was paid. I don't know if Matthew gave money to Dillahunty in order to do this. Money which otherwise could have been given to the Shrimp Welfare Project.
The issue before us is we should believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect God. And when we say we should believe something, the question then becomes the how or the why. This is potentially where, epistemologically speaking, we may differ the most. To quote Hume, the wise man proportions his confidence to the evidence. And so...
Yeah, I'm a little bit annoyed by... I feel like with atheist discourse, again, this is probably for his audience rather than anything, but there's sort of like a few stock quotes like this of Hume's that people love to appeal to. But I think that in a sense, maybe he should just be saying, I agree with what Matthew said, because there's a way of making sense of Matthew's application of Bayesianism, which is essentially just that, right? Matthew's making an essentializing case for how he thinks people can proportion their beliefs to the evidence.
So there are things that aren't particularly well supported by evidence, and your confidence that in their likelihood and the probability that they're true should be lower than things that are incredibly well supported. We have evidence that, or when we have claims that are and ideas that are well supported, we should have a higher confidence in them. I don't think that we can be absolutely certain about anything, but there are things where we may reach what I've called kind of maximal certainty. However certain we can be based on not being able to demonstrate the primacy.
I also think that there's something wrong about this from Matt's point of view, just because with what Matt's saying, because he's talking about it in an inevitable sense, as if there's some kind of like consensus that everyone should be at, which I just think is wrong, because the nature of evidence is so subjective and the world's so epistemically opaque that everyone has such different reasons and considerations that you would expect everyone to be at very different places rather than there to be some sort of like overall consensus or something like that.
See an infallibility of logic, then that would be the maximum. If it's absolute, I don't know. So what counts as evidential support? Not just facts consistent with a proposition, but facts that strongly...
Facts consistent with a proposition. What the fuck does that mean? It's like, it might be tautologous in the sense that a fact would be a true proposition. But like, it's all this stuff people say, like there's all these words consistent with, comports to, like I only ever hear the word comports to used for this terrible theory of truth that some people have, where people say, it's when a proposition comports to reality. And I made a joke out of this in one of my Substack articles where, I said the correspondence theory of truth is needed to save the West. And the way that I phrased it in my run-on sentence it's very, very, very humorous. I said, what did I say? When it comes to science, which is grounded on the belief in a lawmaking God providing the regularities for the study of an intelligible universe, a true theory is when the structure of that theory is... Oh no, this is what I said. A true sentence is one that comports with reality. It comports as things comport in other circumstances where we typically see and say that they comport, as we frequently do. But the joke being, when the hell do we ever say that things comport? Like, is that something... Oh, there's an echo, is there? There's an echo? I can't help you with the echo if there's an echo. Tell me, chat, is there an echo? A true sentence contains terms which refer to the world. Not, they don't refer to the world as a theoretical or sentence construct. They refer to the world. When it comes to science, which is grounded on the belief in a lawmaking God providing the regularities for the study of an intelligible world, a true theory is when the structure of that theory is true in a way where the structure has an isomorphism to the structure of the world, where the isomorphism is true in the sense that the isomorphism has a structure where the structural relations relate to the structural relations in the world with respect to truly structuring them, which means they share the same structure in the sense that the structure of the first is relevantly similar to the structure of the second, in the sense that both structures share the same structures. So it is true that the theories correspond, that is, there is a correspondence between the structure and the world, or the structure and the structure in the world, which is to say, a representation of the relations that shares the same structural components as the structure of the theory. The point being that people say this stuff like, oh, it's what comports to reality, but they never unpack what that correspondence is supposed to be. Or they'll say, well, I know, they'll tell you how they apparently know something corresponds. They will say, because the theories work, so it corresponds more or less. Well, sorry, in virtue of what does it correspond more or less? What does it mean to correspond more or correspond less? And what is doing the corresponding? Like, I can look at a picture and I can look at what it's a picture of, and I can talk about the resemblances between the two images, and I can talk about the nature of the representation in the one case. I can talk about a representation in the case of a map, and I can specify, the spatial relations in that map, and I can look at them as compared to the spatial relations I can see in a terrain that it's about, and I can compare if the ratios remain the same, all sorts of different things. In the case of a proposition or a theory, what is it that is resembling? What in a proposition resembles the thing it corresponds to and is about? It's the structure of the theory. what's the structure of the theory, the syntax, the grammatical syntax, the geometry of the English language that is written in. People say these things, but I think that I don't want to overstate my case. Look, if someone has a good explication of these things, I'm more than willing for them to come along with that and change my mind. But the more I've been asking these questions, the less people have made sense. They've instead just gone on like saying the world structure, like louder and louder, and not saying anything that actually explicates what this correspondence relation is supposed to be. Another move people make here is to appeal to concepts. They'll say, but the concepts are about the world. Like, how can the cat be about the cat if I don't have if the concept cat isn't about cats or something? And how can my concept, in my sentence, London is about London, that's how it's about there rather than somewhere else. And you're like, wait, hang on. Firstly, like, what are these like discrete meanings, and how are the meanings privately represented such that they can combine in the right sort of way to make a correct proposition versus a false proposition? How do they fit together in the right sort of way versus the wrong sort of way? There's these problems I raised before about different languages that don't contain the same grammatical features as English, like which is the right one for being represented in the proposition. And then for, this intentionality stuff for concepts, what are they? Like, what, like pointing, or the concept points to the thing. No, a person points, like I can point to the screen. I can point to you through the camera. I'm pointing at you. Like, I can point with my hand. I can refer. A speaker, a person can refer. But like a concept, like not just a concept as a concept, but as this metaphysical thing. How does that refer to things? It's like a type of like weird mereological thing. Shasset says a proposition is a statement about reality that can have a truth value, and that value comes from evaluations of the extent to which the proposition so see, aligns. How does a proposition align with reality? What does it mean for a proposition to align with reality? Here are some things I can align, right? I can align these. Look, here's an alignment. I'm going to go ooh, and I'll use the yellow side. Out of alignment. It's a little bit out of alignment. And now it's aligned. Oh no, you couldn't see because I had the thing popped up on the screen. That's stupid. Look, out of alignment, in alignment. Look, it's in alignment now. I can align them. I understand what align means there. I can align my bookshelf. Look, the books are slightly wonky. I can align them. How do I align a proposition to the world? What does it mean for a proposition to align to the world? Is it like, what features does a proposition have such that it can align? Like, people, the structure of a theory. What's the structure is like a geometric spatial relation. This is no, because okay, Shasset, chill. When you say how is this hard, it's because you've not actually quite understood yet the depth of the objection that I'm getting at, right? The question is not when will you say the words true and false. Okay. Proposition, I am sitting in a chair. Observation, I am standing. So notice two things here. What you did is you put a sentence in correspondence with a sentence, right? Now, where is the proposition, right? You put the word proposition in front of a word, but where is this entity called a proposition, and what is our theory of that entity such that it can correspond? And how does its corresponding or failing to correspond play any role in our practice of making observations of things? These are the questions, right? So a pragmatist has a complete account of all of this stuff. Someone who views language as use has a complete account of all of that goes on, because the language, the proposition, it's just a sentence, right? and we say words like true or false of sentences. We make observations. These are all behaviors. We act in a certain way. There's no kind of like mystery as to, like the success or failure of the activity in the observation is precisely the what we use to say these words, true and false. In the case, but here's a sufficient explanation where we don't need to make appeal to correspondence relationships or entities called propositions, right? You can say the word proposition was used, but that's the use of the word. It's not the entity of proposition being used by the speaker in any way in the privacy of their mind. Raja asks, what are propositions if not sentences? Very good questions. Correspondence people will say that a sentence is an expression of a proposition, right? So they would not reduce propositions to sentences. They would say that propositions have their own they're a thing. They have an ontological existence of their own over and above my utterances and behaviors. Whereas I don't do. I reduce it all to human behaviors, right? Sentences. No. This is wrong as well, because you don't have like again, your vision is not a representation. You just have vision. You just see things. Your vision is not a representation. You can have you can see a representation in your visual field, right? You can see it. You can see a representation of something else in your visual field, but your vision is not a representation of the world. It just is your vision, you know? Of course, your vision you can hallucinate and it can fail in various ways, of course. How do you evaluate the truth of you have a hand without correspondence? Like this, I have a hand, you know? It's completely question begging, right? It's completely question begging to say that if I do that, I am using it. How does one use the theory of correspondence to evaluate that sentence? Here's a question: do you have a hand? Now, just reflect on your phenomenology of your experience, right? As you like genuinely try and answer that, like try and think about it. Do you have a hand? Like, what is your phenomenology like there? Is there do you actually have an experience? Yeah. So you say intuitively. What does that mean when you say that word intuitively? Just think, what is going on in your mind? Is there my voice, listening to my voice, listening to my question? Reflect. Is there a color? Is there a shape? What is in your mind there? You know, so when you say intuitively, do you mean a predisposition in your behavior to immediately respond with the answer yes? But if you mean a proposition, what is that? What's your experience of a proposition like? Please tell me in the chat what your experience of a proposition is like. Is there any necessary component of that experience? You know, is there? Could you have a different phenomenology and answer the same way? Like, what part of your phenomenology, what part of your experiences is necessary for your use, for your answering in that way, for your saying you have an intuition? You know, I just think I think this doesn't make any sense to me. No. Here's how, right? I got a cup. Here's a cup. Cup exists. I don't got to talk about anything corresponding. My cup doesn't correspond to anything. This is just my cup, you know? You just gotta, what you've got to do is you've got to unindoctrinate yourself from the ways that philosophers talk And then you will realize that you were able to talk all along about what exists and what doesn't. What? I need a mind, of course. What a mind? What's a mind? No, you just need you exist. I don't know what you're saying. A hand is not a part of my mind. I experience it. I can lose it. Sure, yeah, that's my point. You can lose your mind. You could lose your hand, but what's the essential part of your phenomenology there? Like what I want you to do is please describe to me and pick out the phenomenology of your proposition and describe to me what is essential about that, because I just don't get it. If people want me to stop pausing and get on with this stuff, I'm going to need to not have these sorts of comments. But you can't read metaphysics off the fact someone used the word I, right? Does ChatGPT need a mind to use the word I? A metaphysical mind, whatever the hell you mean by that, a soul, property dualism, idealism to be true. Do you know what I mean? Like how is it the case that this sound or marking on a screen can be made without there being this metaphysics being the case? Well, like there's like literally a billion ways. Like maybe a gust of wind blew some characters together that way, you know? So Front Pepper says, how can I guide a blindfolded person through an obstacle course if there's no correspondence? This is the last time I'll comment on this, but legitimately in the psychological literature, this sort of thing is actually, I think you propose this as a joke, but this sort of thing is actually exactly what some people will refer to as motivating the change towards the cognitivist paradigm in psychology away from the behaviorist paradigm. So they will appeal to various arguments that people like Noam Chomsky made around cases to do with rats in mazes navigating their way around, and saying that there wasn't a stimulus in place for them to be able to navigate their way around. And then, you know, there's, in my opinion, a sort of false dichotomy that's set up where either this very simplistic version of behaviorism is true, or they have cognitive representations, right, completely unspecified what those are, what the nature of representation is supposed to be, which they must be using to navigate around the maze. And I plan on getting into some of that stuff at some point, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. I actually think he's wrong here. There's a thing that goes on around arguments where people sort of seem to think that premises are more privileged than conclusions in arguments. But all there is a certain type of logical inference between premises and conclusions, right? There's a certain type of logical relationship between them. But the sort of like status of the premise can be anything. You know, it could be less certain than what the conclusion is. That all depends on the appraisal of the one who's evaluating the argument. You know? Oh yeah, if I'm watching the debate, you can't see it. Shit, I was sharing the wrong thing. Sorry, I forgot to go back. Yeah, so that all depends on the. Thank you, John, for pointing that out. So Matt said this.
It supports it, but I can't quantify it. So belief isn't just about data supporting a syllogism, though that would be the strongest.
that would be the strongest. I don't think that this is right. I actually think that syllogistic or deductive arguments are incredibly weak. It's a really peculiar way of engaging with the world that almost nobody ever does or uses for any good whatsoever. It might be a way that you can think about things in a particular context, but those contexts are pretty rare and strange.
But it's also about warranted belief, which should be frameable in that context. There should be a way to frame a list of propositions such that the conclusion is my brain is rationally warranted in accepting that someone else cares about me. The information is consistent with that. And so when we talk about what we should believe those things that are strong.
No, I've not read Michael Humer's book about progressive myths. I suspect I'll dislike it because I don't really like his politics and philosophy. So, it's probably just going to be a combination of things I disagree with him on. But yeah.
Supported by evidence, and we should reserve judgment until such time as that takes place. So in this particular debate, we're talking about an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being. So let's look at those properties real quick. All-powerful. How can I tell the difference between more powerful and even more powerful and all-powerful? We are simply limited in what we are capable of.
50-50 on whether Matt's got a good point here. I think he's right that there's not a good way. But if you accept the framework that Matthew's laid down, if you've not addressing why you think that framework is illegitimate as a framework to accept, then just as long as you can stipulate it as a hypothesis, you could stipulate each of those things, less powerful and less powerful and less powerful and more powerful, as hypotheses, and just compare them using the framework, supposing that you can assign those priors and likelihoods. So even if it was the case that there wasn't a way for you to tell the difference between those things, just sort of like observationally, in Matthew's mind, by applying the framework that he's put on the table, you would actually have a paradigm for doing that.
Confirming. So, to quote Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in this case, the question then becomes, what does sufficiently mean? Sufficiently advanced.
This is where it's like, fucking, what is this? Like 2005 atheism greatest hits? Like just a bunch of like random quote from Hume, a random quote from Arthur C. Clarke about like stuff being magic, like haha, Sky Daddy magic, like not making good points. But I guess people in this atheist community have been so habituated to being like, that's a good point, to just nod along with that or something. I don't really know.
How do we even address that? And generally, it just means anything that's beyond our understanding, beyond our ken, qualifies as advanced beyond our ability to assess it properly. And if you get far enough beyond that, it might be indistinguishable from magic or indistinguishable from a god. Modern theologians tend to avoid the cookie cutter simple, God is all powerful, and instead describe all power that is logically possible or logically consistent. The notion that.
Yeah, but that would just be one analysis of all powerful that would be given, right? So that like what Matt's saying here again is confused. I think part of the reason that I'm being slightly more tolerant of Matthew's presentation is that he's not coming across as much of like a smarmy dick as Matthew did in the presentation. So I'm having an easier time with it. But like he's like catastrophically wrong on this point. You know, what some philosophers take themselves to be doing is providing some kind of analytic account of what all powerful means. Or they might say, you know, and then they will also quibble over things like whether we should use the word all powerful or maximally powerful or perfect, you know, all sorts of things. But what some philosophers will at least do is they will bake into their analysis of all powerful, like a constraint, like logical possibility. So all doesn't mean the ability to do incoherent things or something. Some will say. I wouldn't say such a thing because I'm not so impious as to presume I can put the divine in a box.
That God couldn't violate the principles of logic is kind of prevalent in modern theological discussions. So I'm not trying to do the "can God create a burrito so hot that he can't eat it" response. But the issue here is, if we're going to say that God is all powerful, I don't know how we can.
Shasset raised a good point. Why do people expect Dillahunty to be a philosopher? He's a dude who forcefully responds to religious tropes. I agree with that. I don't think they should. I think what it shows, though, is, he is often happy enough to sort of like bully people around when they're sort of like stupid young earth creationists from the South. And so I think in this case, there's like a type of hypocrisy on display where when he's outclassed in a particular kind of way, it's interesting to see how he responds in that case. Does he exhibit the intellectual virtues that you would expect of someone in his position? So like here, for example, Matthew saying, I think if you spend your life arguing against a view, you should at least know something about the view. And I think I think we're, as much as Matthew can piss me off, we're in agreement on this point. Like the amount of time he's put into it and how much of a dick he is to the people that he disagrees with, you should raise the bar a bit more above that. Doesn't mean you should raise the bar into like, it doesn't have to be super pretentious philosophy. It doesn't have to be, there's a lot of pitfalls of academic philosophy around signaling intelligence and rationality through pointless formalisms and things like that. But you should at least be able to understand and engage with, the views. And I think that the fact that Matthew doesn't do that, say in the case of like Matthew here, it shows a shortcoming. Shasset points out he got beat up by Jedi. That guy sucks. I can't remember that.
Identify that. The same problem exists with all-knowing. Does that mean all possible knowledge? And what knowledge is or isn't possible? Do we even have the capability of determining all of what knowledge is or isn't possible?
Atelier Velassi is a freak who is now getting put in timeout. Let's not be like, you sexually harass women. That is weird. Don't talk about it in my chat.
Is God
or do it in reality
knowledgeable about the future, and to what extent, and what are the impacts of that potential knowledge? I was accused of being a know-it-all, even though I don't, and that's hyperbole and a pejorative.
Oh goodness me! Look, if I can't find the link right now to the line where Matthew called in, but Dillahunty got so annoyed at Matthew's arguments that he just like went fucking nuts and like spazzed out and like kicked him, and then he had this woman who was with him like like it was weird as anything. Like he was completely in the wrong. He didn't have good points. He didn't have a point at all, really. And that was, right now he might be presenting it as if like he's always. Now I don't profess to always have. I'm open about when I'm wrong. He was not at all in that case. He was like, this little shit, like he's fucking gone calling into my fucking show saying he's got an argument. We all know, like he was like shouting. It was crazy. It was nuts.
And it's a way to kind of get someone who knows a topic better than you to take him down a peg without actually having to know the topic better. But how could we tell whether or not somebody genuinely knew it all? Any sufficiently advanced knowledge and understanding beyond our ability is indistinguishable to us from all knowledge. Could we even think of the question that we would need to ask?
Me and Matthew are bridge building now. We're bridge building. We've had the tensions, but now the heat's on Dillahunty. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Matt Dillahunty shouting, say it isn't so.
Ask to stump the thing that is supposedly all-knowing, to show that it's not.
And it's not just the anger management problems of like how inappropriate that was. I think what it also shows about the intellectual virtues, because like the co-host he had on, like, I don't know what her specialization is, and like I say, not everyone has to be good at philosophy, but she didn't know anything. Like, she didn't know anything, and she was being like a real dick to Matthew Adelstein when she herself had like so much to learn, and she was so like self-righteous about it. It's quite embarrassing, to be fair. But then Dillahunty is like leaning into her affirmation. He was like, yeah, now I feel good because you've reassured me. And the same thing with all the audience. And it just shows, that is no different to Ray Comfort getting a pat on the back from, the faithful after he's gone and talked to an evolutionary scientist about how a banana fitting in someone's hand doesn't mean God exists.
And then we get to the third prong, which is the moral perfection. And that is the same problem. I did a video recently on Is God Perfect, and using the impossibility of perfect circles to suggest that perhaps God as a perfection isn't even possible, but I definitely don't know how we could possibly assess it. And so when I hear someone arguing for an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being, I have to wonder.
I don't think it's crazy to suggest he doesn't know much about theism. People go to seminary and don't know much. One criticism that I've got is that pretty frequently of theists is that, and this is something James and I go over in the apologetics industrial complex, is that in America there is a cottage industry worth billions of dollars of seminaries, of Christian universities, of apologetics courses. And the standards on these things are atrocious. The intellectual standards are absolutely atrocious. Like, people will not learn the first thing about various theologies that exist. This isn't to say that there also aren't good teachers, smart people come out of these courses and, all sorts. Of course there is. But the vast majority of them are terrible. I would even go as far as to say are probably worse than like the syllabus for A-level philosophy of religion in the UK. If you did GCSE and A-level philosophy of religion, you're probably in a better position than you would be if you did than if you went to like some of these seminaries. They're absolutely atrocious. Mono says, one thing I was thinking the other day, Nathan, was how you square being so charitable towards postmodernist writings, but get frustrated. Yeah, no, that's fair. There's probably a little. I think what it's about there is my feelings, which don't care about your facts. Because of my postmodernism, it's that what's so frequently happening. I think that there's a good point that postmodernists have that is often being complete. I think that the baby that's in there with the bathwater is a very, very valuable baby. And I think that people's willingness to throw it out relies on so many of these normalized stereotypes and heuristics against postmodernists that I'm just finding myself, there's nothing in it for me in beating up on postmodernists, right? Everyone thinks they're stupid. Everyone thinks that they've got nothing to say and they're all French nonsense or whatever. So, like if I just join in as another voice saying that, there's nothing in that for me. Like, everyone already believes that. Now, maybe in some leftist circles, there might be I find myself doing a little bit of this sometimes. So I've talked to people who, will talk to me about like Zizek and Hegel, and I just think that they're saying a whole lot of nothing and that they don't think very clearly, and I will have to like deconstruct that. But typically that's not what I'm engaging with, so that's the reason why. And Matthew has a compliment for me. I want to say that while we obviously disagree a lot, I appreciate how measured you're being, which, to be fair, I did say something pretty mean about you earlier, so I'm sorry about that. I think it's funny though. We can both agree it's funny, and I don't actually believe that about you. Yeah, you're right. I got frustrated because I think he's technically right, but being slippery being slippery. And I think that is frustrating, and I see the same thing. This is why I say it's all context dependent on people's like values that they're exhibiting and displaying. So I think if Matt in that circumstance had kind of been more open and like, do you know what? Actually, you've got some points here that I haven't thought about, and I don't have good responses to them, and there is a difference, and you're right. But honestly, like, I'm getting the sense that you're not engaging with me in a way where you want to help me learn. You're more making this intellectual power move. I think that he would have come off as the good guy in that situation, right? So I think that both things are wrong in slightly different ways. Our overall evaluation is going to be like very context dependent. What I said that I said something like you can go and like shoot up a school with the Zizians or something like that. Which is a joke. I don't think you're going to do that. Wink.
Wonder how much of that is hyperbole, or what skills and knowledge and understanding do they actually possess that allows them to evaluate this entity that I have no reason to even believe exists and determine that it has these features. So for the sake of this debate, let's soften the debate topic a bit. And let's say, instead of should we believe in an omni, should we believe in a pretty powerful, mostly knowing, pretty good God? And so the question then becomes not so much, ooh, how can I tell whether or not he's all-knowing?
Matt Dillahunty becomes Philip Goff. Is Matt Dillahunty a Philip Goff Christian? Matthew says, but I feel you've matured beyond such statements. That was 30 minutes ago. You're a new man, and plus, that's a mean thing to say about the person sleeping with your mother. Which one?
But is it sufficiently powerful to create a universe? Is it sufficiently knowledgeable to do so? What are its desires? What are the things it wants? And once again, I don't know. If I pull out a calculator, it has some level of precision and some minimal display where it can put out the answer. And so, is there no end to pi? Or is there an end that we haven't found?
What the fuck is he on about? If I bought a calculator, it has some precision and some display. So is there an end to pi? I suppose that is a good philosophical. That is exactly basically how I look at philosophical questions and the way that they're sort of like confused.
There's no.
Which one, Oliver? Which one did you sleep with? Same goes for you. Did you both cross paths or no?
Into pi, that's our understanding from mathematics. But is anything truly random, or are there just patterns that we can't detect? And if my calculator is only correct to 8, 10 digits, 12 digits, how can I possibly be more accurate beyond that without using some additional tool or method? What types of things?
This is the thing, is that Matthew offered a tool with the Bayesian framework. So like you got to actually engage with that framework. You either say, I don't understand it, so I can't actually evaluate it for you. Sorry, Chief, which is perfectly fine. Like Matthew could be a dick about that. He could go, haha, therefore I've outsmarted you. Or he could go, oh, fair enough, right? Go and think about it. But he won't do that because the audience and everything. Or he could actually engage with the framework and say, here are its limitations that I see, which are analogous to the limitations in this calculator story that I'm telling everyone. And yeah, I think he's right. Matthew spends a lot of time saying you shouldn't believe dumb things for bad reasons. And yeah, I think so.
Definitely wouldn't prove an omnimax God. Almost anything you can think of. Statistics, assertions, holy books, none of them give us the requisite understanding or knowledge.
The atheist experience, the line, some random woman going to everything you say. Do these things give you the requisite knowledge and experience to make absolute metaphysical claims? Like
to confirm that there is a being out there like this. But if we soften it down to, hey, there's a pretty powerful being, and then we try to argue for, hey, here's a universe that we need an explanation of its origins, and this universe or your existence or whatever are going to be more probable if there's a being that's capable of doing that? Yes. And it's interesting, I'll get to in the rebuttal portion, that Matthew and I both are going to reference poker and other things in this, because we're talking about statistics and Bayesian analysis for a good chunk of it. But what if it comes down to...
why did they make eye contact and smile when he said poker?
In this, because...
Look at that eyebrow raise. What's going on? What's going on? Hang on, watch Matthew's eyebrows.
That Matthew and I both are going to reference poker and other things in this.
Why did that happen?
It's because we're talking about statistics and Bayesian analysis for a good chunk of it. But what if it comes down to just merely a claim that gods must be sufficiently powerful, and that on that likelihood, therefore that results in us? If that God came down, the God that Matthew's arguing for, if it came down and stood here, right here with us today, and said, I am that God, how could we possibly tell? What if we only think it's that God because it's more amazing than what we've seen and more powerful than we could have comprehended? And then right when we decide, yep, that's God.
I actually think this is wrong, though. I think whenever you smile, that it is pretty evil. And I actually know this because of a Bayesian analysis that I've done.
Another being shows up and snaps its fingers, and the first God goes away. And then another, and then another, in an endless series of things that are more powerful than us and more powerful than we can comprehend. Why?
Rather than the principle of indifference, I believe in the principle of difference, where I assign an incredibly high prior to Matthew having evil intentions whenever he smiles.
Wiping out the other things that were more powerful. At what point can we say we've reached perfection? Maybe, much like infinity, you can't reach it.
His whole point about that is really stupid because it is baked into the hypothesis. Now, you could make a point about the concept being so amorphous and poorly defined that you can't actually make an analysis based on that being a part of a hypothesis, which is maybe a more reasonable objection. So you would say you can't actually do this kind of Bayesian analysis because the concept of perfection is so underspecified that you can't stipulate what it would look like and like count different ways things would be and stuff. And that maybe that's what he's trying to get at. But the epistemic objection of, from an empirical observation, you couldn't tell the difference between a cause that was sufficient to produce that versus something that was much more powerful, is just not actually engaging with anything Matthew said. Matthew never said, I see some effects and therefore I infer a perfect being because of that. Instead he's saying that if you assume, well, he has a thing of simplicity, which is doing the work for him in differentiating between a perfect being and a sort of limited God, where he's going to kind of compare a perfect being as being having a slightly better prior than a God of limited powers, because of stuff that he says about an ideal language that I don't think is quite right, but he thinks is right. So, and the Swinburne points about infinite versus zero being non-arbitrary and simpler.
Infinity isn't quantifiable. It's not something you could count to. It is a concept. And
I actually counted there yesterday, but
there are bigger and smaller infinities. And yet we live in a world where nothing at all like a God presenting itself to justify itself ever.
I actually counted there across. What I did was I took a whole bunch of irrational numbers written out to decimal places, and I counted diagonally across the irrational numbers all laid out like that, and actually I counted to infinity that way, but it was a different sort of infinity to the one you're thinking of.
Seems to happen. Predictable statistical models don't include God or magic or the supernatural, and yet they're all vastly more...
Okay. he's sort of wrong here. He's right and wrong. He's making an ambiguous claim. If his claim is that there aren't any useful models that contain God, I think he's right. And the reason would be because God's so unspecified in a hypothesis that it just predicts absolutely anything that happens or doesn't happen. And so it doesn't tell you anything. So it's just it's a useless hypothesis. But you could still create a model with it in. I don't really understand his point.
Reliable than any God claim.
I mean, it would be reliable because every observation that you made would be predicted by it. But
God will help you, they say, if you seek him out and he's in the mood. God will intervene in reality on his terms, which may or may not ever happen. God answers prayer. Sometimes he answers with yes, sometimes he answers with no, sometimes he answers with wait, and yet you're never made aware of what the answer is, so you must merely assume that you know what the answer is. Well, let's not assume that the fact that something is unlikely means that we can just invent a magical being, a panacea, to make it seem more likely and declare then that it is in fact real. What morally perfect,
what the fuck?
all-knowing, all-powerful being would allow us to sit around and argue and fight and kill each
I feel like people may think that this is actually a joke because, like, some people in my audience do this sort of thing where they say like, debate Jay Dyer, the man with no truth comes to tell us what is true. But I tell you honestly, for like a few weeks now, this Joey guy's been going at it. There is not a hint of irony in this. He's actually serious. Atheism contains no truth. So like, there are so many things wrong with that. Firstly, that I'm not an atheist, right, would be one of them. Secondly, that the grammar of the question contains truth is just completely messed up. Like, I'm not getting distracted by that, but this person is unironic.
each other over whether he exists and not step in to settle the issue. What morally perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful being would place people in a world where rational evaluation of evidence leads to the most accurate models of reality, only to seemingly exempt its own existence from that standard, rewarding faith, rewarding intuitive leaps that lack justification? I'd argue that such a God is less powerful, less knowledgeable, and less moral than almost any of us. If your kids are fighting,
When would you argue about it? Certainly not in this debate. Over
whether or not you love one of them more than the other, and you don't step in to settle it, you're a monster. Should we believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect God? No. Or more accurately, not until there's sufficient evidence and rational warrant for it. And I have no idea how to get there. This is a subject I've spent much of my life doing, and I used to be a believer, and I used to be a believer for a number of the same reasons that Matthew has presented and that other people have presented. And then I find flaws, both sometimes logical fallacies, not always formal structural fallacies, but instead misunderstandings about causality, or claiming that because something is statistically probable or likely, therefore it's true. And that is always a mistake. And the best example I can give right at the top of my head is, we'll stay away from poker for now. If I roll two dice, two standard six-sided dice, there's a 1 in 36 chance that they're going to come up with double sixes. If I pick up those dice and I intentionally set them down with two sixes up, there's a 100% chance that that's going to happen, which means if you come up to any table and there's a pair of dice there with double sixes up, it is more likely that that is a result of someone intentionally setting them that way than it is that they were rolled that way. And yet you have no way, based on that single observation, even knowing.
Actually, that is incredibly strong evidence that there are an infinite number of spatially, temporally disconnected, modally existing universes that in which people are rolling all possible different combinations of dice. And so you came across this one, and God exists.
Pulling the statistics of dice rolls to determine that was the result of someone intentionally setting them down that way. And yet that seems to be kind of what we're doing.
I think that the problem with Matthew, with Dillahunty Matthew's thing that he's introduced here, is that that actually can be a nice example of trying to apply the type of Bayesian reasoning that Matthew's advocating for, where you would, stipulate certain things. Well, it depends what your prior would be, right, with respect to them, but it could be a nice illustrative example of what you might think, and how you would apply Bayesian reasoning to, the prior probability of someone cheating versus, some kind of quantified probability of all the different combinations of dice rolls that there can be and stuff.
I have no idea how to get to the Omnimax God or a God that's hiding from us or anything else. But when you define God as potentially existing outside of space and time, you have defined it away. When you infer a God to explain gaps in our knowledge or to make that which is unlikely seem likely, you've created a just so story. And so my view is that instead of going with a just so story, I'd rather go with an I don't know that leaves it open to, can you present better evidence for this? Can you show that you haven't just invented a panacea that can be used as a position of insight?
All right, so thanks for that, Matt. So first of all, let's note that Matt has not given evidence against God's existence.
Yeah, I said about this. Anyway, I spent quite a lot of time on this. I think I'll go to just see what audience questions there are at the end, maybe, if they come up.
That does not mean it is more probable that any particular...
Are you ready?
Go for it.
If there are any.
Oh, God doesn't want us to find
why it's wrong. It said maybe there are things that could change his mind, but he doesn't know what they are. I think if you have a position and you're claiming there's not evidence for it, but you have no idea what could convince you or what things would even count as evidence for it.
Yeah. I don't really care about the rest. What is slightly bizarre to me is that in Matt's comments, the comments are overwhelmingly in favor of Matt. Well, that's not weird to me, but it's troubling to me. It's troubling to me that there are not any particular pushback from his own audience on this, when I think he's clearly the one that doesn't have the best arguments here and has a little bit of thinking to do. Anyway, so I'm done with that. Let's have a little look at Taylor's. Let's see what Taylor said. What is falsity? How is it that we come to recognize falsity, and how do we know when something is false? What sorts of things can be false? What makes things false? What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. Something similar might be said about falsity. Philosophers have grappled with this problem for millennia, yet with the tools of analytic precision, formal distinction, and semantic discipline, we are now in a position to approach the nature of falsity in a rigorous and systemic way. Meanings of the abstract noun falsity. The abstract noun falsity has various meanings. It may refer to the general relational property otherwise described as being false. False qua false. You could have had false qua false. Falsity may also refer to the concept that picks out the property and is expressed in English by the adjective false. This sentence is false. Under the correspondence theory of falsity, this proposition is either false or not, depending on whether the world contains a fact that falsifies it. Finally, falsity may refer to some set of falsity bearers that are false, possibly unknown, as in the falsity is widespread, or the falsity at the heart of this. Yeah, I think the point that Sapir is making with this argument, this satire, is that there's no way, using the tools that are offered by a truth bearer correspondence person, to distinguish between the truth bearer correspondence theory being true or the false bearer falsity theory being true, false respondence view being true. So that all of there's a complete parity between the reasons that are being given, and that parity is supposed to show that your grounds for rejecting false bearers are actually not going to be there. And if you still think you shouldn't accept false bearers nevertheless, then maybe you shouldn't accept truth makers too. There are many things that we might describe as false. What is falsity qua falseness? What isn't the fever? What isn't a fever? A temperature of 36.8 degrees. What are the criteria for determining whether S doesn't have a fever? P is false if and only if P corresponds to a fact. Consider the proposition karate isn't even cool. We conventionally associate words with things in the world. For instance, karate refers to a particularly cool martial art. The proposition presents a picture of the world. It refers to a subject and attributes a property to it. Both the subject and the property exist, but they are not related in the way described by P. Therefore, P is false. Composite falsity. Shared falsity makers. I'm gonna refresh for. I'm so stupid. I refreshed myself out of existence. I refreshed myself off of the stream. I meant to refresh this. Where's the cheese? Oh, there we go. Der Mond ist aus Kaiser gemacht. Hesper ist Kaiser. Okay. I'm done. I'm done with your gibberish and nonsense. I gotta tidy myself up. What am I going to do? 2 hours, 30 minutes on this nonsense. I gotta go do some stuff. Do you know what I might do? I'm gonna do some stuff. Fucking 5:20 p.m. Shit me. My day is over. Don't worry. Lance and I will be continuing the Lance and I shall be continuing the Ananka Harris review at some point. Updates on the arm wound. Still, I mean, look, I've been off antibiotics for 2 days and I've not gone septic, and I've not gone septic. It's not growing. So my hope is that it's just necrotic tissue now and I'm all right. But we'll see. We'll see. I think we'll know in like a week or so. It's a Sunday, you should relax. You're right, Oliver. But unfortunately, I'm an idiot who decided to do a master's in statistics and I got coursework that's due. So I got to do that. Because I thought it will be relaxing. But I tell you what you can do is that you can go to patreon.com/digitalgnosis and become a patron, and you can fund my life and studies. Bro got an SS haircut too. Sort of true. And that is to fit in with modern politics. I'm going to be running as a reform councillor. So that's why I got this haircut. I've had some, my political views have switched up in the last week. I realized that woke is bad. And because I realized woke is bad, I decided I wanted to express myself in line with my new political allegiances. and so that is why I look like Oswald Spengler. Anyway, my hay fever, itchy eyes. Why did I decide to do a master in stats? Number of reasons. One of which is because I'm interested in methodology. And these questions of method, they impact and affect philosophical questions that I think are better answered through experimental philosophy. But also statistics is a discipline that has a lot of uses in the social sciences, in questions that relate to meta science. And I think that these are cases of what I would consider to be philosophy done right. I think a lot of academic philosophy is done very poorly, and that these things are applications of skills that I can develop where I can potentially do a good or better job with philosophy. The other thing on that front is that a lot of machine learning approaches are basically computational statistics. And so understanding these things is incredibly useful for being able to use, modify, understand these tools. And that overlaps with my career. And in terms of the directions that I want my career to go in, being able to work on more interesting problems using the tools from statistics combined with my interests in computer science, software engineering, and my skills there is a direction that I'd rather go in. It also enables me to chirp in on a lot of topics that I'm interested in, such as in psychology, social sciences, psychiatry, medicine. People talk a lot about COVID statistics when they try and undermine mRNA vaccines. Being better with these tools is a skill that is very useful for me in all the sorts of interests that I have, topics I engage with, all that kind of thing. I realized woke is bad, so then I bought courses on Derek Lambert's wife's business website. What's it called? mvpcourses.com, was it? That is mvpcourses.com. I can't remember what it was called. Would you rather have digital gnosis or have a physical brain? He really wants to know how many red marbles are in the jar. I knew your beliefs by scanning through your channel. You watch Sargon and like Trump. You will make a great candidate for the Reform Party because you are morally bankrupt. I agree. That's basically right. Me and Sargon of Akkad. My favorite Sargon of Akkad video is the one where he explains critical thinking fallacies, and where he reads the page on fallacies and logic from Wikipedia and mispronounces all the words. That was how I learned about rationality and the West. Yo, I was a web dev 3 years and it burnt me out so much I lost 30 IQ points. I can neither confirm nor deny. How many did you get story points for that burnout though? How many story points in this sprint is that burnout? Did you put it on the Jira board, your burnout? Fucking morons that run the software development world, isn't it? No, it's what's crazy is that there's so many people who aren't morons and put really good advice out there about how to manage good software engineering teams, how to develop things efficiently in a good way. And yet, we end up with what we end up with. You know what I'm talking about. I ain't calling any names. But how could we make good software if the business can't predict velocity? It's a mystery. It truly is a mystery. I guess we'll just have tickets and everyone will play little games where they make the tickets move across the board and all the software is broken then instead, because that is clearly a better state of affairs. Anyway, another rant for another day. AI taking your job. I fucking hope so. Please. I tell you what, people ask about my religious beliefs. I'm a robo-theist. Please take my fucking job, AI. It was an Azure work item, or worse. Here's another funny thing I've seen with some of these people. I've seen people who are unwilling to call out how inefficient quote unquote agile processes using Jira are, who keep and maintain their own fucking Trello board of the shit that they're working on. Oh, yeah. There's life for you. That's what happens when you stick a bunch of monkeys together and you give them computers. Okay, everyone. Goodbye.